Okay, so rank order stability looks like it's very high, it's very noticeable. The one opening you might have if you're rooting for more change in terms of your rank order is that it looks like when we are younger, there's more of an opportunity to maybe change our rank. Now, the other kind of stability, this normative change, is where the real optimistic story, I think, comes through the research. And I'll tell you about a meta-analysis that was performed by Brent Roberts, who's the world's leading expert on personality change. He found 92 studies that administered personality scales and assessed people over 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. The only problem is that many of these studies use different scales, and they didn't use the Big Five framework when they did these studies. But what Brent Roberts is able to do is to go back and relabel and reassign all the scales that were used into one of the Big Five traits. So he reorganized all of the previous studies so that all the data was framed in terms of the Big Five traits. I'll show you the results shortly. He did some other things too, where he kept track of the starting age and the follow-up age, and he standardized everything so you could see whether people are changing by 1 standard deviation, half a standard deviation, and so on. And when I show you these results, I'll do what he does, which is he reverses neuroticism. So neuroticism at one end, emotional stability at the other. But emotional stability is the more desirable, positive, adaptive end. So I'll show you the results where the adaptive end is always what you see. Now, McCrae and Koestner would say that it's likely that we won't change much normatively as we get older. On the other hand, Brent Roberts had a hypothesis that most of us would change in positive ways. And it's mostly because we become more socially mature as we go from teenagers to young adults and further on into young adults. So Brent Roberts assumed that when you're 18 years old, like you are, your parents won't have as much influence on you, and you'll start doing things like taking a job, having a good circle of friends, having your first romantic relationships. You'll be taking on new roles that will require you to be more socially mature, to be less neurotic, to be more confident, to be more agreeable, and to be more conscientious. So the results I'm showing you here are based on 92 different studies, over 60,000 participants. The results have been reorganized, so you can see the age, and you can see how the particular Big Five trait dimension is rising or falling. This is calculated in terms of z-scores, which is based on a standard deviation. So I'll give you an example of for height, for North American men, the mean height is 5'8". Standard deviation is about 5 inches. So if I grew by 1 standard deviation, you would not be looking at Rich Koestner, the professor. You would be looking at 6'5" Rich Koestner, former professional basketball player. It's 5 inches, 1 standard deviation on height. So that gives you a sense of how different you would be if you went up by 1 standard deviation on extroversion or conscientiousness. Okay, so here's the pattern for emotional stability. Let's say from 18 to 33, you see there's a sharp upward trend. And it's highly, highly significant, highly replicable, and generally speaking, on average, all of us are going to become more emotionally stable from the age of 15 to 30. We will be less neurotic, less anxious, less worried. We'll be calmer. So it's very clear there's a nice upward trend, and then it kind of stays level. So emotional stability, the good news is we're headed toward more of that. Now, interestingly, social vitality, these are 2 aspects of extroversion. Nothing happens on that one. It looks like a small difference from 13 to 25, but that's not significant. Social vitality stays flat. That generally, on average, we will not be going up or down on that. But the social assertiveness, let's see what happens with that. Okay, so here's social dominance. This is the other half, let's say, of extroversion. And you can see that there's a dramatic upward trend. So that from the age of 15 to the age of 30, we increase by almost a full standard deviation on average. So if I was talking about height, I would go from here to here. So in terms of being able to act confidently in the world, to ask people things, to tell people things, to volunteer, on average, all of us tend to move up on the capacity to express assertiveness. Openness to experience. What can you see there? Where does it change? I just want to see if you're watching, reading it pretty carefully. Yeah, during the teenage years, there's a pretty sharp rise in openness to experience, but then it stays flat. So most of you would have experienced your boost in openness to experience. So you'll be less conventional, more exploratory. Agreeableness, there's a slower but steady trend toward higher agreeableness throughout our lives. From 20 to 28, that's a significant increase, even though it doesn't look that dramatic. Then you can see things stay level, but around the age of 50, there's a second sharp increase in agreeableness. What you'll notice with agreeableness is that contrary to common stereotypes, people who are older are not necessarily more quarrelsome and cynical and argumentative. In fact, we become more agreeable after the age of 50. Conscientiousness, really straightforward story there, where there's a continuous upward trend. And there we almost increased by a full standard deviation too. Now, the studies I'm describing here are mostly from North American samples. Something you would wonder about is, do you see the same patterns with samples from Asian countries or African countries? And already there's some evidence that in Asian countries, conscientiousness is higher at a younger age, but eventually people in Western countries catch up. But probably through to the age of 25 or 30, it's noticeable that conscientiousness doesn't have to increase. It starts out quite high. And it's probably because of expectations for children and parenting practices and other things. But what I just showed you is actually a picture where a lot of things are changing. And what Roberts would say is people become more confident. That's part of extroversion. They become more warm, which is agreeableness. They become more responsible, which is conscientiousness. And they become calmer. And all of these things can be put together and summarized as we become more socially mature. We're more at ease with ourselves and with other people. Now, this doesn't happen to all of us. That's just the average trend, the normative trend. But it's clearly identifiable. And you have to remember that the rank order doesn't seem to change so much. But the mean levels for the group of us as we get older tends to change. Okay. I imagine that some people, yeah. No, I mean, it's not the importance you give it. I'm referring to your standing relative to others. So on a percentile ranking from, okay, I'm at the 5th percentile on extroversion or social confidence. That's my rank order, is I'm at the 5th percentile. And if you assess me again 10 years from now, I'm still likely to be around the 5th percentile. But even though my rank order is the same, if you assess me on social confidence 10 years from now, there will be many things I can do that I wasn't able to do before. So I'll give you an example. So when I was a 15-year-old, this is back in the 1970s. I'm going to show you clips from this movie later in the course. But in the 1970s, as a boy, if you met a girl and if you liked her, what you'd have to do, or what most often happened, is you would phone her and hope that her parents didn't answer the phone and that you could talk to her, and then you would ask her out for a date or something. And guys, maybe this still happens, but I'll show you how anxiety-provoking and how difficult this can be. So in this movie, let's see. Okay. This is ordinary people. And he met this girl who already indicated that she likes him.
Hello, Janine. This is Conrad. Conrad. Dumb name. Hello, Janine. This is Bill.
His name is Conrad. Oh.
Hello. Hello, this is Conrad calling. Jarrett?
Oh, hi.
I was wondering if maybe you'd like to go out sometime?
You mean with you? Like on a date?
Well, yeah, I mean, we wouldn't have to call it a real date. We could fake it, sort of, see how it goes.
That was dumb. Forget it. Just forget it. Now start over.
Hi, this is Conrad, Jarrett.
I'd love to. When?
Let's see. So what I would suggest is that even though our rank order is not changing, if our social dominance is increasing, it's increasing for other people too. But we might be able to do things in our lives that we didn't used to do. And social dominance increases by a full standard deviation. What that means is that someone like me, who was at the shy end and who was not socially dominant, can begin to take actions that are more confident and assertive and that can have an effect on our lives. So just like Conrad can do that, as our social dominance increases, we can do that too. We still won't jump ahead of our more confident peers, but we can begin to do things in our lives that we weren't able to before. Now, why are we more likely to change between 20 and 30? And here I'm talking about normative change, and the expectation is that we separate from our families, so we might not be as constrained in the kinds of behaviors we display. And when we're in our early 20s, we often have our first romantic relationship, and we figure out what we want to do as a career. So, So the fact that we are displaying more socially mature relationships may be directly tied to our separation from our family and becoming more involved with a romantic relationship and a career track. Something I wanted to mention, they looked at students your age and what happens to your big 5 personality traits over the next 5 or 10 years. And they looked at whether you went to university or you started working right away. Because, half of us don't go to university. And what they found was interesting, which is going to university especially enhances agreeableness. You probably think it's especially enhancing conscientiousness. No, it's your high school friends who started working at 18 who really increase in conscientiousness over the next 5 or 6 years. But university, this kind of surprised me, is that one of the things we learn here is to get along with others, understand others, take their perspective. So there's a slight difference as we go from 20 to 30, depending on whether we stay in school or we go outward. Okay. So I would say that I went down in neuroticism went up in extroversion. Bruce, I think, stayed low in neuroticism and stayed low in extroversion. So the pattern that I followed actually matches the developmental trend that the research usually points toward, so that we should become more emotionally stable and we should become more socially confident on average. Now, how is it possible that there's such normative change, yet so little change in most people's rank order? Here I'm showing a picture of me at age 18. This is my best friend, Tony Cunningham. At age 18, if this was a scale of extroversion and social confidence, I would have been at the 20th percentile. He would have been at the 75th percentile. After I graduated from high school, I lost track of Tony. But 40 years later, he contacted me. He's a professor out in the Midwest. We started communicating by email. And I thought, boy, it would be great to see him again. And I can't wait to see when he realizes how outgoing I've become. Because I really feel like I'm so much more outgoing than I used to be. But then in communicating with him, what I found out is he's become more outgoing too. And he's still doing 10 times more than I am. So even though I feel like I've made this amazing progression, he's also progressed, and our rank order might be pretty similar still. Now, how much are people changing? One of the things that Brent Roberts says is that most of us, on at least one trait, will change a full standard deviation. So I would like to suggest that on social confidence, I changed that much. Now, I've talked about normative change, rank order change. Now I'd like to talk about, let me call it idiosyncratic change, something that is like unique to an individual person. And here the question would be whether certain life events can push us to change, and a life event that only some of us have and others don't. There's not that much research on this, but there are, like a handful of studies. One thing they've looked at is getting your first job, figuring out what your career direction is, and then assessing what impact that has on your big 5 traits. And it's very clear that conscientiousness is very much positively affected by finding out your career track, getting your first job, making it through the training period. So first job seems to be associated with conscientiousness. The other big thing I was waiting to have happen was to have my first love relationship. And there's research to suggest that can have a big impact on certain individuals. So when you're thinking about life events, there's stressful life events, there's meaningful romantic relationship, there's success in your occupation, there's successful psychotherapy, and then the one negative thing that I'll mention is substance use or substance abuse. And I'll focus now, substance abuse, it affects the big 5 traits predominantly conscientiousness and agreeableness tend to plummet. So if you have someone you knew from high school and they're getting addicted to drugs, what you're likely to see is that their level of conscientiousness will drop and their level of agreeableness will drop. Something that does seem to have an impact, and an impact that's pretty broad, is having your first stable, enduring love relationship. So I'll describe a study. It was done in Germany by Nair and Lenhart. There was a replication 10 years later in the US where the same findings were obtained. What they did was they had a large sample of young adults who were around 23 years old, and their big 5 traits were assessed, and they were also asked whether they were in a romantic relationship, a stable, reciprocal romantic relationship, and people would say yes or no. And then 8 years later, they were reassessed on the big 5 traits, and they were asked again, are you now in a stable, reciprocal, romantic relationship? And what they wanted to look at was people's standing on various trait dimensions. I'll show you neuroticism and social dominance. And there's 3 groups here. So these are the people who were single at age 23, and they're still single at age 31. And this is their Z-score for social dominance. So the mean is 0, standard deviation is 1, and you can see the people who were single throughout the whole time, they're, right around the mean on neuroticism. They're right around the mean on social dominance, maybe a tiny bit above the mean. So the people who are single are just like at the mean. On the other hand, the people who are coupled, who at the age of 23, they have a boyfriend, girlfriend, romantic partner, and also have a romantic partner at 31, you see that they're significantly lower on neuroticism and they're higher on social dominance. So those among you who have a romantic partner and keep that romantic partner for a number of years, you may well report lower neuroticism, higher social confidence. The most interesting category are the people who at 23 were like Bruce or like me, and people would always be asking them, don't you have a romantic partner yet? When are you going to get a romantic partner? And then at 32, suddenly they have a romantic partner. And let's look what the difference is. The newly coupled at 23, when they didn't have a partner, but they probably wanted one, they were highly neurotic and low on social dominance. 8 years later, they're now in a romantic relationship. Their level of neuroticism is actually significantly below the rest of the group, and their social confidence is significantly higher. So there's been a total flip for this group of people who went from no relationship to a relationship. The same pattern was found for conscientiousness that I show you here. Yeah, and it was replicated in a study with Americans. Yeah. No, it could be the same. Most often it was the same. It's just whether they're in a stable, reciprocal, romantic relationship. Yeah. Okay. So, let's let's see. So it does look like finding a first romantic relationship can have a big influence on neuroticism, social dominance, and conscientiousness for many of us. Recently, there's been a study that looked at the impact of psychological interventions. So that could be psychotherapy, it could be counseling, it could be assertiveness training. And all of these interventions are not designed to change your big five traits. They're usually designed to alleviate suffering or symptoms of some sort. But a meta-analysis of 207 studies found that most psychological interventions actually do have an impact on the big five traits. And I'll show you this table again. Please don't think that you have to make sense of this. Here's the big five. You'll see that one dimension really stands out. It's changed about 0.7 of one standard deviation, and that is neuroticism. So within 24 weeks, psychotherapy or assertiveness training can have a dramatic impact on our standing on neuroticism. The second big five trait that was most heavily influenced was extroversion. So here are the results. And they also looked at whether this depended on what the presenting concern was. Interestingly, they found people whose presenting concern was personality disorders, they actually still changed quite a lot on neuroticism and emotional stability. Okay, so the overall message that Roberts offers and that I am very happy to endorse is that things get better on our big five traits. So even though to some extent our rank order position is highly stable, there will be a trend toward us increasing on average in exactly the way most of us would like to increase. We will become more emotionally stable, more agreeable, more conscientious, and more socially confident. There are also specific life events that can have a unique effect on our big five traits, like finding a romantic partner and getting therapy. So how much do the big five traits change and why does a change occur? This is the summary conclusions that McAdams offers. So personality traits are consistent but not perfectly consistent. And I would say that there is change that's more normative. Okay. So this is Thursday next class. I'll follow up a little bit with this. Actually, I'm not even sure what I'm doing in the next class. But if you have any questions, you could send an email or you could